그래도 잠깐 말씀드리면은 지금 서섹스 대학의 명예교수로 계십니다. 은퇴를 하셨는데 오늘 아침에 잠깐 이야기할 때 누가 명예교수로 은퇴한 사람이 왜 이렇게 젊어요 얼굴이? 그랬는데 정말로 얼굴이 아주 동안으로 젊게 보이시는 분이십니다. 한마디로 말하면은 경제지리학계의 세계적인 대가이시고 은퇴하시고 난 다음에 지금 호주에 있는 대학이나 또는 중국에 있는 유명 사회과학원 이런 데서 교환 교수를 하고 계십니다. 예, 큰 박수로 던포드 교수님을 환영해 주십시오. 던포드 교수님, I will show you the 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
35 minutes. 35 minutes.
35? Fantastic. Thank you very much.
So, first, it's a great pleasure, a very, very great pleasure to come to Korea. I have many friends, which is a wonderful country. It's also a great pleasure to come to Incheon, and it's a great pleasure to be invited to speak at this CARP conference, which I've already learned a very great deal. Many, many years ago, before any of us were born, a region was actually defined in a way that was rather different from the way in which it is defined today. One of the definitions that I rather like was the idea that a region is an area or a seat of movement, a sphere, or a space of flows. So you think about the flow of water in a watershed, the flow of commodities, the flow of people. Secondly, regional policy initially and regional planning were seen as necessary in the light of some of the tensions and gaps that exist in systems of governance. So in other words, it was conceived as involving a set of actions that are much wider than industrial policy actions designed, let's say, at promoting regional competitiveness. I think that in some ways it's important that we return to this wider notion that regional policy and planning is designed to solve a set of governance issues, right, that arise, in particular, administrative or functional regions. What I'm also going to argue is that in decentralized economic systems of all kinds, growth is largely directed by the evolution of demand. It's going to be the core argument in what I put forward. So one has to look at the sort of trajectories of demand, regionally, nationally, globally, as a way of positioning the strategies that one establishes for the development of particular regional economies and societies. Remember, maybe in the 1950s, 1960s, people made a distinction, which is very important, between what they called basic activities. Basic activities are activities in a region that serve external to the region markets. Of course, a lot of regional development policy has been largely about the development of activities that can, if you like, generate income from outside of the region. At that time, however, people also spoke about what they called non-basic activities. I like to call it the residential economy. In other words, it's that part of the economy that provides goods and services for the people who live, work, and visit particular parts of the world. And I think that in the light of the discussion of measurement and targets and indicators this morning, you can very quickly see that that concern about the development of what some people sometimes call the foundational economy, provides health, education, culture, food, and so on to the local population, is a key element of any regional economy, plays a particular important role in generating income and employment, and has, in many of our discussions of regional policy issues, received much too little attention in the recent past. A third theme, if you like, that underlies what I'm going to say is the importance of development that is both sustainable and equitable. We face extraordinary challenges in terms of climate change, in terms of the way in which we squander the world's resources, but also in terms of extraordinary growth in disparities in income and wealth. It's in that light that it's absolutely clear that future development depends upon what we call sustainable urbanization. So a new model of modernity, infrastructure investment, innovation, targeting in many cases people with modest incomes. It presupposes a more equal type of development. And in fact, I mean, this world is hopefully already embarked upon a trajectory which will lead to more equal development and the emergence of a sort of multi-centered and less unevenly developed world. In that light, I mean, I can sense some arguing that the American way of life, right, is to a large extent unsustainable. In that context, one needs to start to think about the development of compact cities. Right? Compact cities need massive investment. Infrastructure, water, sanitation, schools, medical services. And in interregional and international networks connecting them so that one can build complementarities between different economies. And I'm going to emphasize the importance of actually thinking about regional development in Korea in its regional context in East Asia, and indeed, more generally, in its world context, a context in which one is seeing, hopefully, the emergence of a series of rising powers. Now, this new model, right, clearly involves the support for a whole series of strategic emerging industries. In China, for example, there's a strategy for developing strategic emerging industries, in part to foster upgrading in industrial enterprises, in part to replace labor-intensive and polluting industries, and also to promote the transition from production to innovation. In a series of sectors, right? So there are important industrial strategies, but one needs to develop these strategies at a national level, targeting, if you like, long-term programs for the development of technologies that solve the sorts of social and environmental challenges that we face. Okay, so I want to say a few things briefly about theories of regional development. Essentially, you can say economic development involves a never-ending interaction of changes in demand that give rise to changes in supply and vice versa. You can read the slide, I won't elaborate. So I'm arguing that demand-side drivers play a very important role in promoting trade, industrial, regional, economic development. In the recent past, we've seen the emergence of a new supply-side economic geography associated with Fujita, Krugman, Venables, and so on, which essentially identifies a series of arguments in favor of concentration and agglomeration. This view has led to a set of policy conclusions. Policy conclusions are summarized in a way by, in the UK, the Treasury, in 2006, when it said, theory and empirical evidence suggest that allowing regional concentration of economic activity will increase national growth, as long as economies of scale, knowledge spillovers, and a local pool of skilled labor result in productivity gains that outweigh congestion costs, the economy will benefit from agglomeration, efficiency and growth terms increase. I mean, actually, I think, many metropolises, especially in emerging economies, are rapidly becoming dysfunctional because of the extraordinary growth of a series of diseconomies, which are seriously underplayed in many of our discussions. It's also a problem in many advanced countries. And it comes back to this issue of how do you build a network or system of sustainable, compact, sustainable cities. Policies that aim to spread growth amongst regions are running counter to the natural growth process. So they're difficult to justify on efficiency grounds. That's a rebuttal, of 50 years of regional policy. And it's an argument that I think has to be challenged. They say unless significant congestion costs exist. So that type of model has led to what one might call metromania, reflected, for example, in publications of the OECD or in the World Development Report of 2009, reshaping the economic geography of each country and indeed the world. In the 1970s, the Hungarian economist Nicholas Kaldor wrote a series of very important papers rooted in a Keynesian tradition. And he argued that regional development depends on exports. So this is this basic sector of the economy, which means exports less the import content of exports and net capital flows adjusted for corresponding flows of income. And then he argued that exports can stimulate investment and output, and that can actually trigger a cumulative expansion of output through its impacts on investment and productivity. So in this case, a model is being put forward which emphasizes to a considerable extent the importance of demand in shaping the trajectory of a regional economy. Kaldor, of course, underemphasized the importance of what I call the residential economy, the non-basic sector, the services that are provided to people who live and work in a place. But, I mean, I think that on the other hand, this emphasis upon the role of demand in shaping regional trajectories was a very important insight. You could say export performance is driven by the regional ability to contest or compete in external markets. So clearly, competitiveness strategies matter. Once global demand expands, or once wider demand expands, those regions that will win are those, of course, that are relatively competitive. So competitiveness strategies matter. Specialization in dynamic medium, high-tech industries, the evolution of the terms of trade, the capacity to attract foreign investment, the capacity to attract talent. But these things depend on infrastructure endowments, agglomeration economies, the skill profile of the workforce, innovative capacity, the capacity of a region to attract inputs. So these supply-side strategies matter, but they must be put in this context of a model in which demand, in a sense, plays a significant role in shaping regional trajectories. This view was, of course, associated with what has now become an outdated view of regional policy. But I suppose I'm arguing that current problems actually require much more emphasis upon some of these earlier regional policy approaches that were largely abandoned with the neoliberal counter-revolution. I won't dwell on this issue. I mean, I think I agree absolutely with things that were said this morning about the importance of alternative indicators. That instead of simply measuring GDP, one should also measure real wealth. The target should relate to wealth, stocks of capital as well as flows. And that total wealth includes not just productive capital, but includes intangible capital, the shape of human capital, institutional capacity, social capital, net overseas financial assets, and it also depends on natural capital, which leads in the direction of measures of green gross domestic product. Social preferences are non-additive, so one actually needs also to have targeting both in terms of GDP, but also in terms of the provision of a series of environmental services. And it leads in the direction of a rather different, orientation for regional policy and regional planning. To some extent captured, in this diagram, which I don't have time to dwell. Now, these new strategies also have significant financial implications. So that they raise serious questions about public finance and about the significance of public assets. And you'll see later on that I'm going to argue, drawn something James Mead wrote in the past, emphasizing the importance of public assets, where if public assets are used efficiently, they can actually generate streams of income, and they can reduce the degree of reliance of governments on taxation and debt. Also, it relates, of course, to these ambitions to create new multilateral credit institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the BRICS Development Bank, which are going to fund, projects, important regional development projects of one kind or another. Okay, now, why should you position regional policy in this wider perspective? Well, the first thing is, if you look at the world today, there are obviously significant disparities in GDP per head. To some extent, a good deal of the growth potential, I would argue, that exists in the world lies potentially with those economies that have relatively low levels of income per head. Well, this chart plots GDP vertically, population horizontally, and surface is equal to total GDP. So one could say China, India, the rest of Asia, significant parts of Latin America, Africa, these are all parts of the world, right, that have significant growth potential in the sense that there are large numbers of people with relatively low standards of living, where there's a significant possibility for the growth of income, employment, and so on. Well, illustrated in relation to China. If you look at economic performance in the world, which tells you something about the evolution of demand, you see the progressive decline of growth rates in the USA, progressive decline of growth rates in Western Europe, declining growth rates in former communist Eastern Europe, and then a catastrophic collapse in output after the transition to capitalism after 1989. One sees decline to some extent in the performance of Latin America, Middle East, and Turkey, and Africa, especially through the 80s and 90s. Some upturn in Africa in the last decade. And then you see the sustained high growth rates of East Asia. I know that Korean growth rates are slowing, but in this sense, you know, East Asia has been a sort of success story in terms of economic development over the last 40, 50 years. If these trends continue, it means that the center of economic gravity in the world is going to shift. This is a diagram produced by Danny Quah, an economist at the London School of Economics, where he shows how the economic center of gravity of the world has moved from the middle of the Atlantic in 1980 to somewhere between Izmir in Turkey and Minsk by 2008, and will, in all probability, by 2050 lie somewhere on the Tibetan Plateau in China, between India and China. If you look at the case of China, it has seen a reduction of 600 million in the number of people defined as poor using World Bank standards. In the rest of the world, poverty has increased. But this scope for decreasing poverty is associated with the creation of a whole series of possible markets that can drive development, especially of those places, if you like, that produce the sorts of goods and services or equipment that are needed in order to raise living standards in these parts of the world. And in order to develop these possibilities of interregional connection, establishing complementarities, there is an important need for investment in a whole range of infrastructures. There are a whole series of projects. You know, I know the Korean government has its own projects. The Chinese government at present is developing this one road, one belt strategy, developing closer integration in order to enable complementarity and in order to try to enable, if you like, different regions, different countries to participate in potential future growth. So I think that it's partly in this type of context that you should start to think about regional development potential. I don't think, you know, the Western world really faces relatively slow growth for a series of reasons. I don't want to spend too long on this issue, but basically, I mean, this is a story of what happened to regional inequality in Western Europe, for example, from 1945 until 2014. Basically, you can see that it fell dramatically from 1945 until about 1980. And in that period was so-called unprecedented golden age of fast growth and full employment. So fast growth and full employment were associated with a reduction in regional inequality, in part because less developed areas grew more rapidly than more developed areas. Since then, you've seen relatively limited progress, relatively slow progress, and much slower growth. Social inequality, these are various measures of the share of income going to the top 10% and to the top 1%. Basically, you can see the same sort of story. Now, in the period after the Second World War, a significant reduction in the share of income going to the top 10%, a significant reduction in the share going to the top 1%. And then you have like 30 or 40 years of relative equality, after which you see the explosion of inequalities. China's going the same way, right? The share of the top 10% there is the Western European countries. So this period of low inequality was also a period of very fast growth. This period of rising inequality has been a period of much slower growth. Europe has these large disparities that are regional, which I'm not going to dwell on. These regional disparities are associated, for example, with this extraordinary polarization of trade, surpluses and deficits. So you see the surpluses here of continental Europe, especially Germany, and then all the Nordic countries. The countries that we saw this morning are doing exceptionally well in terms of satisfaction indices, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. And then you see the poor performance here of what I call the Anglo economies, principally in the United Kingdom, and then these are the Mediterranean economies down here. So basically, is a problem in these high-income economies of sustaining high rates of growth. And these problems were identified a long time ago, for example, by Keynes. Keynes argued that capitalism is driven by a quest for accumulation, that a time will come when there is enough capital to produce efficiently the output demanded. Okay? And at that point, there's a problem of reconciling this situation with this situation of sufficiency of capital with the competitive drive for profit. And it's part of that problem that has underpinned the difficulties of Western economies. Victoria Chick, a Keynesian economist, said when opportunities for profitable real investment fall away, it is more profitable to make money out of money than to lend for investment in producing real goods and services. Productive investment gives way to consumption and asset inflation fueled by increases in debt, themselves supported by leverage and financial innovations. The financial side of the crisis will take a long time to unwind. And then in Europe, in a sense, there's another problem that's associated with the integration project, because Europe has embarked on a path of monetary integration. With monetary integration, you exclude exchange rate adjustment. If you cannot adjust exchange rates, there are 3 adjustment mechanisms. One is migration. The second one is downward wage flexibility in relatively uncompetitive economies. The third is solidarity or fiscal transfers. In 1977, this was ahead of discussion of European monetary integration, McDougall, the British economist, wrote a report with a series of other people in which he pointed out that if fiscal federalism was to offset asymmetric shocks after the loss of monetary independence, the EC, at that time just 6 countries, the EC would need to spend 2 to 2.5% of GDP in a pre-federal stage and 5 to 7% in a federal stage in a small public sector. The EU budget amounts to 1% of European Union GDP. That budget, a significant amount, is spent on regional policy. That regional policy is very imaginative, but you can see that it is extremely small in relation to the sums of money that McDougall envisaged would be needed in order to absorb the sorts of economic shocks that all economies suffer. So I've suggested a series of factors, if you like, as to why you've seen this growth slowdown right in Europe in this case, and why that scenario is probably a scenario that will continue in the years to come. And I've suggested that to some extent growth potential, on the other hand, lies especially in those parts of the world where there are large numbers of people on relatively low incomes. China. China, we know, has had 10% growth rates for 30 years until recently, when we've seen a reduction in its overall growth rate. That growth recently was largely concentrated on the East Coast. So this just shows you the trends in Chinese regional disparities. Basically, through that period of export-oriented growth, you see here this very, very strong increase in disparities between the coast and the rest of China. We also see, by the way, this strong increase in urban-rural inequalities. Although, it's striking that more recently this gap in inequalities between urban and rural areas has started to fall. The gap between the provinces of China has started to diminish since the development of regional development strategies have been implemented. And also the gap here, if you like, between the coast and the rest of China has also started to diminish. What's important to say, actually, some people have argued that Chinese modernization is an instance of twin-track reform. Twin-track, Pareto improving economic reform, which means that Pareto improving economic reform is one that makes some people better off and no one worse off. Okay. And you can see here, that if you look at China, urban income has gone up steadily, average income has gone up steadily, the income of rural areas has in fact gone up steadily, but actually the gaps are getting wider. Even if you take the designated poor counties in China, income has been increasing more slowly than elsewhere. So you can see the income has been increasing everywhere. And it's because of that, of course, that you saw this extraordinary reduction in poverty. China's growth through that period of expansion up until the financial crisis was driven, of course, by a trade surplus, accumulation of foreign reserves, substantial flows of inward investment, which are now being translated into flows of outward investment, and this year outward investment has started to exceed inward investment. and by extremely high rates of capital formation. So the red there is gross capital formation, which you can see accounts for 45% of GDP. So, what underlies this transformation? Well, it's partly underlaid, and it's what will underlay the transformation in other parts of the world in which there is scope for urbanization by an urban-rural transition. So if you look at China, the rural population, in at the time of the establishment of the new China, there you can see that 88% of the population was rural, right? 84% were farmers, right? You can see that at the start of economic reform in 1978, 79, 80% of people were farmers. Today, rural. Today, 47% are rural, 34% are farmers. They only produce 10% of GDP, which is one European observation. So half the population is not yet urbanized. Because what is actually, this is the age profile of the population in China. You have the male, female, and dark blue is male, urban, female, urban. The blue, this whole area here is the rural population. The dark shaded bit is the male, rural population, which was moved to cities temporarily, right? So 260 million people have moved to cities without actually becoming full urban citizens. In many cases, there are lots of reasons for it. Many of them would later on go back to the countryside from where they came, having accumulated income in the cities. China's future growth, says Li Keqiang, is going to be driven by urbanization. So one of these projects is the so-called the 100 million people question. And as I said, the aim is to settle 100 million farmers in cities and towns, right in the eastern half of China. To transform the living conditions of 100 million people living in what they call shanty towns. They're not like shanty towns in Brazil or India. And people living in what are called urban villages, so villages swallowed up by the physical expansion of cities. And to urbanize 100 million people in the West. So if you look at the difference between average rural and average urban income, you can see what's going to drive increases in income, and what's going to drive increases in demand, and what's going to drive increases in the size of markets. But of course, this also involves massive infrastructure investment, as I said, in sustainable cities. China has reduced poverty. You know, if you go to China, many places, what you encounter is what I call hypermodernity. 15,000 kilometers of high-speed rail track constructed in a period of about 12 years. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's the high-speed rail network. But large parts of China are said to be unsuited for development, largely for geographical reasons. It might include, for example, areas up on the Tibetan plateau. These areas, right, are areas with significant poverty. So this, in fact, is a poor household, Tibetan household. This is their mantelpiece. This 50 years since the establishment of autonomy in Tibet and China. There are in China 14 areas of this kind that have been identified in China's 10-year poverty alleviation program. All of them are mountain areas, largely. They're areas that are ecologically problematic. They're areas with significant numbers of minority peoples. They're areas that cross provincial borders and therefore require cooperation. The program for these areas is essentially a regional or area development program that is designed to, if you like, economically resolve the problem, not through welfare, economically resolve the problem of poverty. So in this case, you can see area development becomes part of a key regional development strategy, and insofar as that area development is successful, it's going to generate large demand, markets, and potential for economic expansion. Those are the 14 areas again. So, you know, since the financial crisis, China has started to embark on a new sort of strategy aimed more at the expansion of the domestic market. So, one of the ways in which it started to do that was through the establishment of course, new areas. The first new area, you know, was basically this one, Shanghai. Well, the second one was Tianjin, which was in the news recently, of course. The third was Chongqing, and we'll talk about Chongqing. More recently, they've added Lanzhou up here, Xi'an over here, Guiyang in the province over here. So, the development of these new areas, but also, in a wider sense, the aim of development is one that is centered upon, if you like, the urbanization, if you like, of a significant part of the population that has not yet been urbanized. This, realizing the potential, right, of these new markets, like what I've already indicated, involves raising the income of people who have relatively low incomes, modest incomes. It includes many people who live and work in cities. So it has implications for models of innovation. So I said here, instead of large multinational corporations and networks of subcontractors developing innovations for elite markets that diffuse with difficulty and slowly, from the richest first and then creep their way down, you could think of a new model of innovation, which is a model that emerges in emerging economies and in those parts of the world that are close to them, which is associated with the development of new products that respect environmental constraints, that deal with environmental challenges, that give access to modernity to people with modest incomes. So this model involves creativity, innovation is incremental, cumulative, and innovation at low cost. The potential is extraordinary. The potential is extraordinary. It involves, as I suggested, you can't have millions of people moving to cities and all owning motor cars, especially ones that use, generate carbon emissions. It's true that cities, as Glaser argued, are centers for increasing returns. He actually pointed out that high-density Chinese cities can increase productivity and actually reduce environmental impacts, reducing emissions, reducing energy consumption compared with diffuse cities. And to some extent, Korean cities are also high-density cities. I've said that in China, there's a plan to add 400 million people to the urban population, to invest in education, migration, partly to end poverty in the countryside, attempts to raise farm productivity on consolidated holdings. These projects also involve massive investment in water, sanitation, schools, medical services, so it needs a very high investment rate. But basically, rich cities are cities of consumers, so these cities will raise demand. If you have high density with efficient public transport, you can avoid the problems of congestion, noise, air pollution, the waste of space, from car parking lots and so on, that are associated with our modern cities. So, in a sense then, I've said, start to think about regional development in terms of this basic, non-basic distinction. Start to pay more attention to the importance of demand in driving regional growth. Think about where you are in the world and about the creation of networks that enable different economies to engage and interact with one another. Think about the potential for new markets that are associated with lifting those people who are still poor out of poverty, moving many people from the countryside who work as farmers with low incomes to cities where they have higher incomes. But to some extent, you're thinking about the development of products and markets that target the situation of people with relatively modest incomes on the one hand, and you're thinking about ways of targeting the environmental challenges that we face at the moment. And I think in the light of that, you can think of, because Korean people are extraordinarily innovative, have come up with many, many extraordinary innovations, they have a lot of potential to actually contribute to this kind of program, which is actually a program not just for Korea, but for Korea, if you like, in its relationships with its partners, near partners, and also ultimately those that are more distant from